Hello and welcome to a new episode of Interpreting India. From geopolitical complexities to economic uncertainties, India faces critical challenges in its quest for a more prominent role on the world stage. This season, we at Carnegie India continue to bring voices from India and around the world to examine the role of technology, economy, and international security in shaping India's future. Today's episode focuses on artificial intelligence. It offers wide-ranging welfare and commercial applications and is a prominent tool for geopolitical dominance also. Exactly 1 year ago, India launched its national AI mission, which primarily focuses on AI infrastructure, including compute, data, talent, research and development, capital, algorithms, and applications. India has recently announced the procurement of over 18,600 GPUs and announced building an Indian large language model. However, focus on three elements is seemingly low: talent, data, and R&D. It is unclear as to how these three critical enablers of AI be promoted, streamlined, and actioned for India's AI ambitions. Joining us today is Anirudh Suri, who recently published a detailed paper on the topic titled The Missing Pieces in India's AI Puzzle: Talent, Data, and R&D. Anirudh Suri is a non-resident scholar with Carnegie India. His interests lie at the intersection of technology and geopolitics, climate, and strategic affairs. He is currently exploring how India is carving and cementing its role in the global tech ecosystem and the role climate technology can play in addressing global climate challenges. He's the author of the book, The Great Tech Game, Shaping Geopolitics and the Destinies of Nations, and is currently the managing partner at India Internet Fund, a technology-focused venture capital fund based in India and the United States. Anirudh, welcome to Interpreting India.
Thank you so much, Shatak. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Anirudh. So just to begin with our first question, could you please tell us about the premise of your paper, which highlights the need to focus more on talent, data, and R&D for India's AI ambitions?
Thanks, Shatak. So, the overall global context, Shatak, right now is that, as we've been hearing a lot, is that the two major tech superpowers of our world, the US and China, who also happen to be, I would say, the AI leaders, right? The leaders in the AI wave currently are locked in this intense battle to lead in AI. But that obviously, from an Indian standpoint and from the standpoint of various other countries like France, UAE and others, Japan, etc., raises the question of what happens to those countries. Are they relegated to a minor role in this global AI race? Or will they be able to create some kind of niche for themselves, even though the US and China are the clear leaders currently? And that's really the starting point for the paper, where I then asked the question, will India specifically be able to compete and lead in AI, or will it be relegated to basically a minor role, right, from the sidelines, watching what's going on and then maybe benefiting on a more ad hoc basis on an applications layer maybe? And that's why when I dug into what is really required to win in AI, I've leveraged the framework of the AI stack, something that the US National AI Commission also put out a few years ago in 2018-19, and which incidentally India's National AI Mission, which as you rightly pointed out, was launched a year ago. Both have used that as the starting point, which has 7 elements, right? Out of which I feel like that the 3 missing pieces in India's AI strategy are what I've highlighted in this paper. While over the last year and a half, the Indian government, METI and others have laid an emphasis on 2 pieces very clearly, which is availability of compute. And there's a lot of discussion around developing a sovereign LLM or a Indic set of models. I think while discussion is focused on those 2, my own analysis suggests that unless India focuses on these 3 foundational pieces of the AI stack, talent and top-tier AI talent, we can talk more about that, R&D, again, cutting-edge R&D in AI, and data. Having a clear data strategy to have some kind of proprietary data that Indian researchers, Indian startups can leverage to create something innovative on the world stage. Unless India gets these 3 pieces right, we are likely to fall short of our stated ambitions, which is to be an AI leader, right? So to become that AI leader that India, both the private sector and the government have very clearly tried to say is our ambition, we've got to get these 3 pieces right. That's basically what the paper argues.
Thank you so much, Anirudh, just laying out the scope of your paper. It's very useful. And you mentioned the India AI mission, and since it was announced and you laid it out in your answer that there has been a primary focus on compute and India has procured a certain number of GPUs. And India is on a particular trajectory. And when you speak about the competition between US and China, then maybe India identified compute as one element it wants to focus on to be a global superpower. Now, knowing that India has focused on compute and it wants to use those compute for certain use cases, how can the Indian government better integrate its focus on compute and the three missing pieces in the AI puzzle? Because the starting point of compute is already there. It has traveled 1 year. So how does your three missing pieces integrate into India's compute focus, or do you see them to be focused separately? What is your vision on that?
So, Shatak, my view on this is that there's these pieces have to go in parallel. So while, the geopolitics of the last year and a half, where Taiwan became a hotspot, potentially a geopolitical hotspot, it raised a lot of concerns in the US and other parts of the world, especially in Europe also, that there was an overdependence on TSMC and the advanced chips coming out of Taiwan. And in the broader US-China competition, Taiwan's clearly a geopolitical hotspot. Tomorrow could become a battleground. And hence, having a resilient supply chain on compute, on AI chips became very important from a US and European standpoint, and similarly from an Indian standpoint. So while that emphasis over the last year was important, given the geopolitical realities of the world, I think the other three pieces have to go in parallel with our focus on compute. Otherwise, this compute becomes, to a large extent, simply compute to be used for applications.
Got it.
Which will help India come up with certain applications and have the compute available for startups and for researchers to do regular work in AI, but not cutting edge. Right? So if India wants to have that cutting edge AI leadership, it's got to have the top tier talent sitting in India, top tier AI research talent sitting in India to make use of this compute that the Indian government has been trying to, in a public-private mode, procure. The 10 to 18,000 GPUs that Minister Ashwini Vaishnav has also announced we've procured or almost procured. Secondly, unless you have some amount of proprietary data to leverage, I'm not sure what kind of cutting-edge innovation we're likely to then see coming out of India. Right? And similarly, as I was mentioning, unless we have greater amount of R&D spend and a lot more focus on the R&D ecosystem in AI, we are unlikely to come up with an innovation like the one that we've seen come out of DeepSeek in China. So my vision is that these four pieces have got to go together as the foundational pieces. And then I think applications and, venture capital flowing into our AI startup ecosystem will follow.
Thank you, Anirudh. Thank you. So you have nicely highlighted the cost of basically not focusing on these three elements if we go forward. And you've highlighted it to our listeners that we will only be making new applications, but won't be at the cutting edge of AI and won't be a global AI superpower. And now maybe is the right time to actually dig deeper into the three sections that you've identified in your paper. So could you help our listeners understand the primary challenges for building AI talent and the possible solutions to overcome them?
Yeah, so Shatak, what I've tried to do in the paper, and for those who will read the paper in detail will see, what I've tried to do is for each of these three elements, these three missing pieces in India's AI puzzle, as I've called them, for each of them, starting with talent, I first diagnosed the problem in greater detail, right? And then provided recommendations. So let me do the same right now, which is, when we talk about talent, the talent piece of the AI stack for India, you'll often see that we talk of India as a talent nation. We talk of India as being the source of a large chunk, 15 to 16% of the global AI talent. And while that's correct, if you dig deeper, the diagnosis of the problem suggests that we have at least 3 or 4 kinds of problems on the talent front that we've got to tackle head on. One is that there's an overall shortage of AI talent globally. Right? Having been a relatively new wave, even though AI has been around, I think it's become the hot thing only over the last 3, 4, 5 years. And therefore, there's an overall shortage globally for AI talent. Even the US is facing it, China is facing it, Europe is facing it, as is India. Then we have a second problem, which is that of talent migration. A lot of our great talent coming out of the IITs of our country ends up, and I have a great chart in the paper that people should take a look at, which is basis some of the research done by Macropolo and the Stanford HAI, the Human-Centered AI Institute at Stanford, which shows that most of India's AI talent today that's coming out of the IITs and the great undergrad institutions we have ends up in the US and to some extent in Europe for their PhDs, and then ends up working in Silicon Valley and tech firms in the US and to some extent Europe, right? Most of it is not actually staying in India. So we have this issue of talent migration. Third is the quality of talent. There's a large amount of upskilling required, and this is something that India's IT services firms are very actively working on also, because they have a lot of the tech talent sitting there servicing global clients, but they've got to be upskilled for AI usage, right? For integrating AI into their workflows. And then finally, fourth, as I point out, the fourth part of this talent puzzle is a suboptimal mix. While most AI superpowers like the US and China have a good mix of all three layers, the top tier AI research talent, the middle tier talent that I would say is the layer that helps you create new solutions that are sector specific, etc. And the third tier is the lower tier, which is the regular AI engineers, etc., data engineers. India has a good mix of the middle and the bottom layer today, sitting in India's IT services firm, sitting in global capability centers out of Bangalore and elsewhere. But we don't have the top tier talent, right? So we've got to have a suboptimal mix today. We've got to get to the optimal mix. How do we get there? Which is the second part of your question. I think that the analysis of the problem or the breaking down of the problem also suggests the solutions. Right? So to attract the top tier talent and to prevent that talent from fully migrating, you've got to create a vibrant research ecosystem in India for AI, right? Which requires funding, which requires a great set of people to be sitting here. Great research talent wants to work with other great research talent. Right, that's the benefit of hubs like MIT, Harvard, Stanford, Silicon Valley, that there's a lot of great people working there together who benefit from each other. So India's got to create those hubs. We are starting to at IIT Madras and IISc and some other educational institutions, and we've set up, the Indian AI Mission has set up these new centers of excellence, but we've got to really scale this up, fund them much better, make them globally competitive so that we can retain some of that talent that are otherwise migrate to stay, and hopefully also to attract back some of that talent, right? So that we have a good mix of talent going on here. GCCs and these great R&D centers that most MNCs have set up in India today are also a source of great AI talent. They're doing great work within these institutions. We've got to encourage them to come out and set up either their own research labs at these COEs that the AI Mission has set up, or possibly set up startups, etc., of the kind that we've seen done by DeepSeek, and so on and so forth. I think these are the kind of solutions that I've outlined in greater detail in the paper that can help us solve the talent piece in particular.
Thank you so much, Anirudh. Talent has always been the issue with AI, but also other emerging technologies in the past. I think whenever India digs deep into the problem of its non-dominance, so to say, in emerging tech, I think talent has always been an issue. And in AI, we can't afford to miss the bus, so to say. On that, I had just one observation first is you've written recently for the Hindustan Times on DeepSeek and on how India should step up. I had read it somewhere, I'm forgetting the source, that the founder of DeepSeek actually hired a bunch of PhD students from leading universities to work on the AI model. And China basically had the base. It had the talent base to tap into, which currently India is lacking. And probably India's focus is towards using compute efficiently or giving it more funding. But if the talent ecosystem is lacking, then nothing will probably come out of it. That's a major fear. My question to you is on talent. Do you identify any specific stakeholders who can step up? In the longer term, of course, we'll need the civil society, academia, government to step up. But do you identify any particular stakeholders within the government in terms of ministries, departments, or within the broader ecosystem in terms of the type of companies which could step up to actually help India bring this talent for AI?
Yeah, so I would say two kinds of stakeholders, right? One is the well-funded or well-capitalized companies of India. And there are a lot of large industrial conglomerates that are stepping into this, right? So while we don't have the Facebooks and the Amazons and the Baidus and the Alibabas of the world, right? We don't have large tech companies like that. We have large IT services firms on one hand, which have healthy balance sheets. And then we have conglomerates like the Tatas and Reliances of the world, again, with very healthy balance sheets that I think should step up to attract some of this talent, pay them well, set up these AI R&D centers either within themselves or in partnership with educational institutions like IITs and IISCs and others. And then second, if the Indian government truly believes that this is a strategic priority, and as you rightly said, if this is a bus we cannot afford to miss, then I think the highest levels of the Indian government should step up and attract this talent. Right? I think this kind of model we are seeing in France, for example, where President Macron held not the current AI summit, but held an AI summit domestically. And as you know, Mistral is an example of a non-Silicon Valley based startup that has come up and done very well in the foundational AI model space. And there, my understanding is that President Macron, with a bunch of advisors, got back a lot of these French talent that was working in Silicon Valley to come set up Mistral, right? Jan LeCun has spoken about that, who's the head of R&D at Meta. And even when he was in India, he mentioned something similar, that India should be looking to do something similar on the top tier AI R&D piece. And I think so if the Indian government also sees this as a strategic priority, then I think the top levels of the Indian government should do their bit to attract some of this talent back. And, little words of encouragement can go a large way, along with funding from some of the private sector players I mentioned.
Thank you, Anirudh. You've highlighted who is to now step up and solve this missing piece of the puzzle. I'm just recalling one paragraph.
The talent will not come back. I mentioned this example, I think in my HTP, is that Arvind Srinivas, who's an IIT Chennai grad, he's been back in India recently as well, met with people, I think, in the government as well and others. I think to attract some of this talent back is not as simple as sometimes just offering money and, let's say, encouragement. Yeah. They've also got to see the whole ecosystem, right? Otherwise, if they are at the cutting edge in Silicon Valley, some of this talent, they won't just move back that easily, right? So It's got to be encouragement, funding, and ecosystem that's got to bring them back. And of course, it's not to say that great talent is not sitting here within India already. But I think it's got to be the mix of that kind of talent that's been at the cutting edge along with Indian AI talent that I think can be the right formula for us.
Thank you, Anirudh. I think and we can move on to the next section on data. So if you can help our listeners understand the primary challenges for accessing data for AI and the possible solutions to overcome them.
Yeah, so on the data piece again, the open AIs of the world and some of the other models, foundational models, they have basically digested a lot of the data that was publicly available on the web. They've crawled the World Wide Web and the data that existed there. Plus, they have accessed a lot of the private databases that exist. They've paid for it in many cases. In some cases, there are issues, as I'm sure you're also aware of, copyright issues that, players like the New York Times and others have put out against some of these large AI firms. But the point is very clear that a lot of the world's data that existed publicly and in private data sets has been ingested by some of the early movers in the AI foundational model space. I don't think that Indian AI startups have had either the funding or the access to that kind of data. Right. And so if you hear the founders of Sarvam and other AI players in India, you'll see that for them, lack of data is a big issue. Right. And so while there's been talk of synthetic data as a replacement for that, that's really a secondary move, not the primary move. And so lack of access to large volumes of data is a problem for Indian companies. There's very little there's sparse proprietary data available for Indian researchers or Indian startups that's India specific. Right? It just doesn't exist so much. While there have been efforts both by the government in the form of India Datasets Platform, as part of the India AI mission also, while there's been talk by, the likes of Nandan Nilekani to, let's say, try and crowdsource data that's either Indian language data, multilingual data, I don't think any of those efforts have scaled. So that's another issue. Third, I would say that the data sets that are existing in India, that are India specific, whether that are lying with Indian e-commerce firms or Indian tech companies, the likes of Flipkart, Ola, Zomato, etc., these have largely remained siloed. Similarly, within the Indian government, a lot of data sits within Indian government departments. whether it's agricultural data, logistics data, trade data, so on and so forth. A lot of this has still remained siloed. So siloed data, unstructured data is still a problem. And I would say fourth issue on the data front, Shatak, is that there's an over-reliance currently on the India Datasets platform and the Indian government to solve the data problem. And I don't think that will eventually work out, right? I think even in the US case and in the Chinese case, you'll find that the data problem is solved by multiple players, right? Not by the government alone. So I don't think that we should be relying in India on the Indian government alone to solve the problem of access to data, existence of data, and creation of data, right? Good quality data ultimately. And I'm trying to now basically segue into the solutions that exist. I think that we've got to do a much better job of leveraging the transactional data that does exist, whether it's in the case of UPI, whether it's the case of Ola, Uber, Flipkart, Zomato, Swiggy, right? We have so many now payments players that have been built on the basis of UPI, right? So transaction data there. There's healthcare data now increasingly. We've got to have the right framework to access that data much more easily in the form of data exchanges that should have the right kind of guardrails for privacy, anonymity, etc., so that none of this data gets, should not be personally identifiable, etc. Secondly, I think the government has to do a better job of unlocking the silo data that exists across its various departments. So to scale up the kind of open gov type efforts that the Indian government has initiated, but really scale it up very quickly and give priority, hopefully, to Indian startups and Indian companies to access their data on priority vis-a-vis some of their foreign counterparts. I think there's a lot of voice data that exists in India. A lot of entertainment, multilingual entertainment data that exists on the platforms like YouTube, etc. Obviously, today, around the country, we are talking to each other in different languages, in Tamil and Telugu and Marathi and Punjabi and, you name it. I think there has to be created a framework to access maybe some of this voice data without violating any privacy issues, right? That can help us really have proprietary data for India that then Indian AI model researchers can build upon. And finally, I think instead of having reliance on India Datasets platform as the only entity, we should have multiple data marketplaces that come up in the private sector as well. The US has done this. Various data marketplaces should come up to provide some of this data in a very legal framework way to researchers and startups that are willing to pay for this data and access this data. Right, so I think that's in a nutshell. Of course, I've outlined it in greater detail in the paper, but that's in a nutshell, I think, the set of problems within data and the possible solutions that exist.
Thank you, Anirudh. I mean, absolutely. There's more detail in the paper, and I would urge all the listeners to go through your paper in detail for all the three sections and the context that's provided for it. The way I see the data section, one is the digitization angle. Not all available data which could be used, not all data which could be useful for India is digitized in the first place. Correct. And we can't follow what the West did and use data of the internet, which is not representative of our local context and culture. That's the first bit. The second bit is, even if the India Datasets platform can do a little, there's problem even there. There are siloed data within government departments which need to get unlocked. And third, there's the issue of a lack of access to marketplace data. So on the second bit, the government one, I think it's on the government. There's nothing more that I think the ecosystem could do. I think if government departments could speak to each other in the data language and break the silos, that'll be better. And probably if all of the possible data comes on the India Datasets platform, at least the volume of it increases, then at least it'll get something going. But as you highlighted, I think marketplace data is one of the bigger untapped resources for the India AI ecosystem. Anirudh, I was just wondering, if we do go forward and explore this, what could be the challenges and bottlenecks here? Because if we access the marketplace data, there could be IP issues, or there could, I'm thinking as a private player, if I'm sitting on a lot of data, why would I give it to the ecosystem just out of goodness of heart? So what is the incentive? Maybe we can align some incentives for them. So how do we actually make it happen? If you want Google and Amazon to give it away, give their data away. If you want Zomato to give the data away, so what is the incentive for them there?
Yeah. No, I think that's a great question. So first, on the government front, I think it's not just on the government in the sense that I think the ecosystem can provide certain incentives to the government departments to unlock more of that data, which is in the form of applications. See, today, if, for example, let's say there's a lot of agricultural data or logistics data sitting within a given government department. The government departments, historically and understandably so, are hesitant in putting that entire set of data out. But I think the incentive that could be put in place is if there are certain problems that, let's say, the transport department or the road and highways department today is facing, okay, which could be, let's say, pollution related, traffic congestion related, etc. Or just, we want to bring down our logistics costs in India to help our GDP growth, etc., help our competitiveness globally, right? As Mr. Gadkari has often said. If private players could work with these government departments to show that by leveraging this data, creating applications, private sector would create these applications that could then help the government department help solve some of the problems that they are looking to solve strategically. I think that provides a good set of incentives for the government department to unlock more of this data, right? As opposed to just saying, let me unlock the data and let someone then either mess with it or play with it. I think that might not happen realistically, as you rightly say. But I think that kind of synergy could help unlock that data. Now, on the private sector data, why would a Zomato or a Swiggy or a Flipkart unlock their data? See, now let's look at the US. Why has, let's say, a Google or any other large big tech firm opened its data sets to any AI model player? It's not been that, my sense is, again, some of this is really behind the scenes, so we don't know for sure what has actually transpired. But my sense is that what has happened is that different players that were holding the data have aligned themselves with different AI model builders. So Amazon has funded Anthropic, Microsoft has funded OpenAI, etc. So now what that suggests to me is that most likely what's happened is that certain tech firms have opened their data sets to certain AI players and not every. So you could see something like that also possibly play out in India, where, maybe Zomato doesn't open out its entire database to everyone. I'm just using Zomato as a placeholder. But it aligns with certain AI players, certain AI researchers to say, fine, with you, there might be an equity relationship there that, the holder of the data take on in the AI startup, right? Like Microsoft did with OpenAI or Amazon has done with Anthropic. So Zomato could do with another player, or Flipkart could do with another player, or PhonePe could do with another AI player, right? So that they have a stake in there. They will see some kind of financial benefit. And that could be the right incentive for them to share their data, not necessarily completely openly, for all, but to a select set of players that then have a financial incentive for the data player and for the AI company to benefit. So again,
So, and like nobody will give their data for free and not out of the benevolence heart. Even in the government department, they will need something in return, and rightly so. I mean, they need to see a benefit down the line. And thanks for highlighting those two use cases: the private sector helping the government with their application and welfare schemes, probably, and then private companies probably giving it to model builders. In India, I'm just wondering if it could happen with domestic companies giving their data to someone, a company like Sarvam, or others who are building their LLMs. If that happens, that's probably a good case scenario. Now, let's just move to the final section of your paper, which is also a critical part, which is R&D. So, what do you see as primary challenges for R&D, and how to overcome those challenges?
Yeah, so again, once you break down the R&D piece of the puzzle, Shatak, you realize that there's, again, much like on talent and on data, as we've discussed already, there's a few layers to the R&D problem. The biggest one is, of course, that we're not spending enough as a country. I've highlighted that in my book also, in The Great Tech Game. Many people, I think, both from industry, academia, and government have now been highlighting this over the last 2-3 years, especially that India is just not spending enough. Both the Indian government as well as the Indian private sector. I think our spending levels on R&D broadly is at about 0.6% of GDP. Most countries that are ahead in, what I've called the Great Tech Game and this tech competition are upwards of 3%, right? 3-4% of their GDP, right? So I think that applies in AI as well. I think we're probably not even spending proportionately that much in AI, right? Whereas countries like the US and China are spending a lot on AI R&D, billions, right? Our entire national AI mission is $1 billion plus. But countries like the US and China, which are the AI leaders, are spending several $1 billion. If you look at the private sector and the public sector spend multiple billions of dollars in AI R&D. So in India, we're just not spending that kind of money, right? One can argue that we are not as rich in terms of GDP per capita or overall GDP as the US and China. But I think at least as a percentage of our GDP, we should be spending a lot more. So that's one. The private sector is definitely not spending enough. Right. The government has set up the ANRF, the Anusandhan National Research Foundation. I believe 1 lakh crore over 5 years is what's been allocated in the most recent union budget also and otherwise when it was set up. But there's that spending problem. And we can discuss how to resolve that. Second is that we have, if you look at a lot of the benchmarking on R&D institutions, top educational institutions being AI R&D institutions across the world, you'll find that the top 10, top 20 are largely US and Chinese, right? Educational institutions that are at the top of the rankings in AI R&D. So we have a dearth of institutions that are doing quality AI research, linked partly to the other two pieces we've discussed, the data, the compute, the R&D talent, and of course the R&D space. Third, very interestingly, as I point out in my paper, I have a couple of charts that show this very clearly. One is that in the last 3-4 years, the research papers coming out of India as a percentage of total AI research papers has gone up very steadily. So since 2018-19, India is seeing a big jump, actually. And we are closing the gap with, let's say, the US, China, and to some extent Europe, which is a very positive sign. But that's on the quantity of AI papers, right? So there we are really seeing and surprisingly and in a very pleasant way, I think we're seeing a good uptick coming out of India AI research. But where we are not seeing the same kind of uptick is on the AI patents, which to me suggests a quality issue, right? And to a lot of people who are studying this issue, if the number of papers is rising, but the number of patents is not rising, there suggests a quality issue. We're not at the cutting edge maybe of AI research. That's one possible implication. And which again goes back to the top tier research talent piece that we've highlighted earlier in our conversation, that we've got to have that top tier AI talent doing the research in India for us to also then be doing getting a lot of AI patents and conference citations, etc. Right? So that's another piece of this. And then finally, I would say that the centers of excellence that we have set up under the AI mission, under the India AI mission, need to be resourced a lot more, right? I believe that they were initially set up with about 990 crores. Another fourth one was announced in the union budget recently with another 500 crores, which is, again, good amount of funding. 1,500 crores is not an insignificant sum. But I think, if you're going to be at the cutting edge, 1,500 crores will probably get spent just in getting the right amount of compute that is needed. And so then how do you pay the great talent that you need at these COEs to do the cutting edge research? How do you get them to buy the data that they need to buy, right, to pay? Because as you rightly were pointing out, the private sector is not just going to give it out for free and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of other costs that we've got to budget for if you want these AI centers of excellence also to be globally competitive and cutting edge.
Thanks, Anirudh. I mean, that's very detailed, and I think if there's intent to solve this piece, I think the data is out there, and I think more than any other piece or any other pillar of the India AI mission, I think the evidence of what is the problem is, in my opinion, this is the maximum in this pillar. I think R&D in the spend is less, patents are low, although research papers are high. So I think that's well covered. If I may, if we can just take a step back, I was just wondering of all the three elements, I think talent and R&D probably go hand in hand. And if India looks to increase its effort towards both these, how can it marry both of these elements together? Because I'm just wondering, and maybe for my benefit or for the listeners' benefit, you can probably just break it down for us as to how will better R&D lead to better talent or vice versa. Because if we solve them together, we have at least two problems solved. Is there any one or two key takeaways which you could suggest for the Indian ecosystem to solve for both of these? Because I can't imagine one being solved and the other being stagnant.
Yeah, it's a bit chicken or egg, right? The top tier talent will not come here if you don't have the right R&D ecosystem.
Yeah.
The R&D ecosystem doesn't get built unless you have the top tier talent sitting here. So I agree with you that there's clear linkages there. I think that if you look at how some of the other countries have done this, I think one key learning is what I would suggest, which is that while India cannot today suddenly say that we'll jump from 0.6% of our GDP being spent on R&D and R&D institutions being, let's say, mid-tier today in the global context, to suddenly being top tier and suddenly spending 3% of our GDP, I don't think we can expect that to happen. That's unrealistic, I would say, as a recommendation for any policymaker or any tech leaders to implement. So I think the solution here, like with any chicken or egg issue, comes down to creating pockets. Pockets of excellence. Pockets, like the COEs or the AI research parks at some of these research institutions in India. You create pockets. You don't need that many. You needed one DeepSeek for China to shake up. For Mistral, one Mistral coming out of France for France to lay a real stake in the ground in the AI ecosystem. And the US has, let's say, 4, right?
Yeah.
So it's not like we're looking for 10 or 5, right?
Yeah.
1 or 2 innovations, whether in the LLM space or in some other aspect of the AI research ecosystem, can place India on the map. And therefore, I think creating pockets of excellence, which is 2 or 3 good research labs, maybe 5, which requires 20 top-tier research talent to be sitting there. Some already sitting in India, some maybe that we bring back if needed. And funding is, again, $1 billion today, Shatak, is not that much if you look at the private.
Yeah.
$1 billion is really not that much today for some of the large companies that we've discussed. So it's a matter of, I think, focus, and that's what I point out in the paper, clear focus areas. We should say, okay, maybe it's in the healthcare space that we want to do some innovation in AI, or on the education front, which is what the Niti Aayog paper has said. We want to focus on some of these socially relevant sectors. You can take some of those, but then do everything that's required in that AI stack approach. Get the data to be available, get the top tier talent to be there, get the right private sector partners to give you the right kind of data if as needed, right? And I think that kind of approach can help us resolve this chicken or egg problem. We shouldn't seek to become a China or the US to begin with, but I think we should solve it in a pockets of excellence, or I would say focused approach.
Thank you, Anirudh.
Around too far and wide and taking a AI mission and saying, okay, let's set up and give money to everyone. I don't think that approach will necessarily.
I think the key takeaway is we just need one. We don't need 4. We don't need 5. It's one DeepSeek.
I think that's the other piece I would highlight. It doesn't have to be an LLM. There's a lot of innovation happening in the AI space. And so we should figure out, okay, where in that AI research ecosystem, and that's why getting some of this cutting edge research talent from globally, which is seeing where are the gaps to then work with Indian researchers, can help us find that niche for ourselves.
Just an interesting sidebar, Anirudh, like if you had to bet where India can do best, where will it be the LLM? Will it be something else? What do you think is most likely for India to succeed in? Like, what's the most probable?
It's hard to say. I think we're putting a lot of eggs behind the LLM basket now. But I really think that's where a lot of money and a lot of the top tier talent globally is already there. Not to say that we couldn't do it. We could do it. But I think that there's so much else in the AI ecosystem beyond LLMs that maybe is not mainstream today. And if you see, the innovations typically happen in areas that are not considered mainstream often. So I would hope that, we can have the research ecosystems develop in other aspects of AI research as opposed to just the LLM.
Sure, Anirudh. That's good food for thought. We need one, and not only one not one LLM, one anything big, I guess.
Yeah, and that will really kickstart the ecosystem. It'll give a boost to the venture capitalists that are looking to fund AI startups. It'll give a boost to the AI research ecosystem. It'll give a boost to India, even when we talk about shaping the global regulation around AI. You've got to be at that table, the regulation table, from a position of strength. Is
Sure.
my
So Anirudh, I mean, we are moving towards the end of the podcast, and I think the last piece is a very critical one. It's the geopolitical one. All of these three missing pieces of the puzzle you've highlighted, they are basically look toward the domestic ecosystem, and India needs to solve them at one level or the other on all these three fronts going forward domestically. But India is situated in a global geopolitical sphere. And interestingly, this is a very dynamic and for some would say it's a disturbing geopolitical time. The US is doing something slightly different from what it used to do earlier. It's high on the deregulation agenda. It's pushing for AI infrastructure, and it probably doesn't bother much about if it's coming from renewables or non-renewables. The Europe is getting more cognizant about its regulatory stance, and it understands the value of innovation in the long term. And of course, China has come out with DeepSeek. It has always been at the cutting edge of technology. Given all of this, and we recently also had the Paris AI Action Summit where PM Modi highlighted India's priorities. It's one, to democratize access to AI resources for the global south, prioritizing certain use cases, and then also to some extent enabling safety norms for the global south, especially. With all of this happening, where do you see these three puzzles? And specifically, I mean, to not sound vague, specifically, how can India use its relations with its allies? Because US, for instance, specifically in a recent joint fact sheet, has announced that it will try to unlock US-based AI infrastructure for the Indian market, and it has given itself a time until the end of this year to identify the roadblocks and then work on top of it. So, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think on the chips piece, on the AI infrastructure piece, I think with the diffusion order, the recent fact sheet, I think that this is something that India will have to skillfully navigate, that it doesn't get locked out of or doesn't not get priority access to AI infrastructure. So even if we don't get necessarily the largest number of most advanced AI chips, hopefully at least we are getting access through some of the cloud hyperscalers, access to AI compute. And, there are partnerships happening right now between the AWSs of the world and the cloud providers in India. For that, hopefully India will also get some exceptions done on the diffusion piece. So we don't have too strict a limit on the number of advanced AI chips that we can access. That's on the AI infrastructure. I think that's a matter of skillful navigation, where I think much like India is doing generally geopolitically, skillfully navigating the tough geopolitics of our world today, I think we'll have to do the same thing. Now, as far as talent is concerned, the three pieces that I've highlighted in my paper, talent, as we were discussing earlier, we're not so dependent on, our partners and friends, and we've got to become much more proactive on that as a country, both in terms of private sector players and the government and others, right? As far as data is concerned, again, I think that's largely a issue to be resolved and tackled domestically. I think it's the R&D piece where international partnerships are most key, right? And can be most helpful for us. The US and Europe and UK have some of the best R&D institutions in the world that Indian R&D institutions can partner with. We can do a lot more joint collaborative research, incentivize that kind of joint collaborative research. I think that's starting to happen. I'm seeing the signs of it in various recent joint statements coming out of the US and India. The ANRF doing a partnership with the NSF in the US. I think there's signs that will happen. I think we've just got to push that a lot more. I think that R&D funding also, to the extent that we can do joint partnerships, joint R&D projects, hopefully we can benefit from some of the R&D funds available globally as well. I think as we do more of these joint collaborative R&D papers on our AI, do maybe joint patents, you'll find that the entire ecosystem will benefit in India. And as a result, the piece that we were discussing earlier on the R&D, that the whole R&D ecosystem has to be elevated in India in terms of both quality as well as focus. I think that'll start to happen with these international collaborations. So I think we should be pushing, whether it's with Japan, whether it's with Europe, whether it's with the UK, whether it's with the US, or other countries that have, let's say, even research excellence in certain verticals. We should be doing a lot on that, right? If you look at even how the US and China have done in the last 20, 30 years, there's so much R&D collaboration that's happened between those two countries, right? I think that's a great model for India to say, let's do a lot more actually on the joint R&D front with our partners.
Sure. Thanks, Anirudh. It's good to know there are three missing pieces and where we need to look domestically only and where probably international help won't help to a larger degree and where the help is out there or where it could be explored, and it's R&D. It's good for our listeners to know that geopolitically where these three pieces sit. So before concluding, Anirudh, I mean, do you have any final comments or do you see any trends or something like that going into the future on these three missing pieces or India's AI ambition broadly? Where should India target to be, let's say 1 year from now? The India AI mission has went well. We have the compute, we're thinking about LLM, but clearly these three pieces are lacking. And it's passé to say that, I mean, it's time to act on it now. So any forward-looking thoughts to conclude from your end?
Yeah, so I'll add a couple of things, right? I think one, Shatak, once as a country, as a set of private sector players and as a government, once we decide that this is a strategic priority, I think then the resourcing of it should match that, right? I think that has to match. So I think one, while we have a great start to the AI mission, well-funded, 10,000 plus crores, etc., pointed out, but that's over 5 years, right? So it's 2,000 crores a year roughly. We've got whether it's the private sector that brings in more capital, we've got to resource our strategic ambition here in AI, I think a lot more. That's one. Second, I think that we've also got and I mentioned this, the Hindustan Times piece that you were referring to also on the implications of DeepSeek for India. I think we've got to also put our weight very clearly behind the open source movement in AI. I think that even in the US, there's a big debate right now between the closed source and there are companies representing the closed source ecosystem in AI and AI models and AI research. And then there's the open source set of companies, right? And Mistral and DeepSeek and Meta and many other companies now globally have put their weight behind open source. And I think for India, at least in the short term, it makes a lot more sense to be backing that open source movement in AI so that we can also, and our researchers and our startups can benefit from open source innovation happening elsewhere in order to help us catch up quickly. So I would say those are the two other points I'll highlight.
So thank you, Anirudh. I mean, that's a great point to end. I mean, where to look and where to focus. And you've laid it out in more details in your paper. I would urge all the listeners to read Anirudh's piece, which is on Carnegie India's website. And I've had a great learning experience reading your paper and through this podcast. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you so much, Shatak, for having me. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Anirudh. To our listeners, we'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. To make sure you don't miss it, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast from. To learn more about our research and team, you can visit us at carnegieindia.org. You can also find us on social media on X, Facebook, Blue Sky, and Instagram. Thank you for listening and see you next time.